You now have a finished edit. You have your intro title, you have music that fades in, it changes different volumes from time to time depending on if you have dialogue that comes in. You have your B-roll, you have it all color corrected. You maybe even have applied a color LUT, and you have it all timed out to the beats of the song. And then let's say at the very end you want to have some fades, and on this one as well you want to fade it out, so at the end it goes. Okay, so now we press O, then at the very beginning we press I. That creates our in and out point for our entire project. Basically that means if we did have, for example, some other footage here in our 1080p edit, that would not be exported because our in and out point is set just to here. Okay, so now that our in and out point is selected, our next thing to do is export it. We can go up to File, Export, Media, or we can press Command M. So let's press Command M. That brings up our export settings panel. We can move the window around, we can make it larger if we want. Okay, we have our source and we have our output. So if we move this, this is our timeline length, and the blue is what we have our in and out point set to. So if we want to set it to a spot where we can see, our source looks like this, and our output looks identical right now because it's just set to a pretty high quality export. If, however, we were to set it to a really low quality export, when we're in the output setting, this would look much worse than this. It's basically a reference and compares your output to your source. All right, and then in the next lesson, we will start creating some export presets. Okay guys, welcome back, and in this lesson we will discuss creating some export presets. We have our Export Media tab open. Okay, up here we have our format options. If we were going to DVD, we'd click this. If we were going to Blu-ray, we would click this. So for example, let's click DVD. Then we can set it to NTSC wide, wide progressive, and so on. And then in this case, we'd have a little bit of black bars. So what we do is we'd go to stretch to fill or scale to fill, whichever you prefer. Blu-ray, we can work with the same idea. We have a whole bunch of different presets. If we're going to the internet, then we would select H.264, and then we will create a whole bunch of different presets that show up here. So right now, we're working with an HD timeline with HD footage at 23,976 frames per second, and so we need to create a 1080p preset. Okay, so let's get started. So we have right now width 1920 by 1080, so that's perfectly fine. 23,976, progressive, aspect ratio is 1.0, which is fine. TV standard NTSC, that's great. Level 4.1, okay. Render at maximum depth, we want to check that. You'll notice that now it's changed to custom because we've changed something. We want our bitrate encoding to be 2-pass. This will take longer, but it creates a much higher quality export. Okay, the next thing we want to do is select use maximum render quality. If we're working with HD footage, 1920 by 1080, I would normally keep this at around 26. And this one can be 26, 27, or 28. I normally just keep it, 2 above. So the target bitrate is 26 megabits per second, and the maximum is 28. Okay, let's go to audio. Audio format is AAC, that is fine. At 48, we want to export as stereo. Audio quality high, and kilobits per second is 320, that's great. Okay, so that's all the settings we want to change. So let's go up to the preset. We'll click this button right here. We'll create a new preset. We'll call it 1080p 23.976 and at 26 megabits per second. We'll click that. It has now created a preset. You can already see that I've created one very similar to that. If we were exporting to 720p, for example, we can use this as a starting point. Then we can uncheck this here. We can change this to 1280 by 720. And because it's a smaller resolution, our bitrate doesn't need to be as high. So we can set this to something like, 16 or 18. And then we'll just do this a little bit higher. So 18 and 20. Everything else stays the same. We can go to Save Preset. We'll just change the very beginning to 720. And then we'll change this number to 18. Press OK. Now we have a 720 preset and a 1080p preset that we created. Using the 1080p as a guide again, we'll create a 4K preset. In order to create a 4K preset, we will change the height to 2160. We will change the width to 3840. That automatically changed the level to 5.1, which is great. That's what we need. We can't have this high of a resolution with a lower level. Bitrate encoding, still always 2-pass. Target bitrate. Now this we need to make a little higher, so I normally do around 35, which means 37. And we'll save that as either 2160p or 4K HD. And then megabits per second is 35. We'll go to OK. Now we have a 4K, 720, and 1080. So now we want to create a standard definition one. To do that, we will keep our 1080p as a starting point. We will uncheck this. We will create the height as 480. We will make the width 852. And then we will stretch to fill. And that just cleans up the one layer of pixels at the bottom. Okay, so it's important to understand that the reason why it's 852 by 480 is because we're working with widescreen footage that has a 16:9 ratio. If we were working with 4:3 footage, then we can actually work with this being 720 instead. But if we use 720, then the image gets stretched a little bit. So let's go back to 852. And if we go to source, if we compare the source to the output, you'll see that it's slightly different. But that's okay because we are converting high definition footage to standard definition widescreen, so it's okay to have a little bit of a loss. We do not need such a high bit rate. We can set a max of, let's say, like 8 or 10. Okay. And then we will save a preset as 480, and we'll set that to 8. And then we'll just make a note this is widescreen. Okay, so now that we've created all the presets that we need, let's go back to the original preset of 1080p because we're working with the 1080p timeline. We have all the settings set up. Audio is good, video is good. We're exporting both video and audio. Okay, then we need to name our clip, so we can click here. Let's create a new folder called Finals. You can call this whatever you want. Okay, we'll call it Fall 2015. Click Save, and then we can hit Export. It's rendering the required audio files, and then it begins encoding our entire edit. Because it's HD, it will take a few minutes to export, but once it's done, then you'll have a desktop version that you can upload directly to YouTube or Vimeo, and the quality will look great. If you're working on multiple edits at once, and you'd rather export them all at the same time overnight, you can do that, and it's called batch exporting or batch rendering. At the bottom here, you can queue up a whole bunch of edits and send them all to Adobe Media Encoder to be rendered all at once, one after another. So we have an output name, we've set our preset for this export, we'll go to queue. Okay, so Media Encoder is open. Once it loads it, you'll see here, so here's our edit, it's H.264, there's the preset we've created, this is where it's going, and we could continuously load as many as we want, and then hit the play button to start encoding, and it'll one by one render all of them. So we don't need to continuously keep pressing export and export every single time. It'll just continuously go one after another. That's called a batch export. To give you an example of that, let's go back into Premiere Pro and we'll set a different output. We'll press Command M to open up the export media panel. We'll call this one Fall 2015 Short because it's a shorter edit. We'll save, we'll queue it, and then you'll see it loads a second one with the different name. If we click Save, it'll start exporting our video. Once this finishes, it'll automatically start doing the next one. This is super handy because while this is exporting right now, we can actually go back into Premiere and start working on a different project. In fact, we could even close Premiere right now and Media Encoder would still be working. Sometimes in editing, you want to send a lower version just as a reference file for your client to see. In this case, you don't need to send such a high quality video that has a very large file size to it. Instead, we can create a much smaller preset and also include time code in the edit here, which makes it very easy to communicate with your client over the phone, for example, because they can tell you what time code they want the change to happen at. So to create a lower resolution preset, we can start from the 1080p as default. We can uncheck this to start editing, but we will also select this so that it holds the constraint of both of these. So let's click on the height. We'll call this 360, and then it defaults the width because we have this selected to 640. So it keeps the aspect ratio because we've selected this. So what we can do is set this to about the same as standard definition, which for a smaller frame size will have a pretty good resolution. And then this video will only be 33 megabytes. The next thing we'll do is go to Effects. Under Effects, we can add a whole bunch of different things. We can actually add a color LUT right here in the export preset settings. So we can do cinematic, for example, day for night, desaturation. So we'll turn that off for now. We can overlay an image. If you wanted to put your company logo, you can do that here. If you wanted to just add a name, you could do that here as well. So here we can overlay time code. So time code, now that that's checked, shows up here. We can move it where we want, so let's just bring it down just a little bit. We can increase the size or lower it. We can mess around with the opacity. I normally just keep it around like that, move it down just a little bit. And this makes it really easy for the client to say, hey, at 16 seconds, I'm not crazy about that clip. Can you please remove it and replace it with something else? And based on that, you can know exactly where and what they're talking about. Okay, now that we have that all set up, let's go up to preset settings. We'll call this 360p at 8 megabits per second, and we'll call this client reference time code and save effects settings. Let's press OK. Then here we have 360p with time code for a client reference. We have 4K, 480p, 720, and our 1080. So we can export that or send it to the media encoder and queue it up. And again, this is a much smaller file size. So let's just compare this. So this is the estimated file size that Premiere thinks this will create, so 33 megabytes. If we were to go back to the 1080p, it's going to be 106 megabytes. So very small compared to the full HD. So for reference purposes, this will be perfect for your client.